practices or ideas. What is climate mitigation? What is adaptation? Just to get the feel a bit more, get a picture of what's happening in these ideas. Mitigation. What does mitigation mean for urban regional development? Sustainable urban development is strongly connected in the discussion with sort of a good model for mitigation. If it is, that means from this idea of European city, this model of European city, those cities are said to be quite well mitigated because they produce a low amount of CO2 and other emissions. So that is said to be post-compact cities. Again, having the possibility of traffic by biking, also by walking distances. So again, not producing a lot of CO2, so that's said to be positive. Or green cities, because green cities, they are also from the CO2 perspective positive. So many ideas of earlier models of sustainable urban development suddenly become interesting again from the point of mitigation. That's positive because it gives new arguments to those ideas which are quite strongly developed in European cities, but in many other parts of the world there's still a strong discussion in America. For example, US cities often are not developed in this way. Making urban infrastructure sustainable. Again, we have the possibility of traffic systems, an old discussion, how to combine settlement structure, settlement development with public transport. That's again, it's even fostered this discussion by mitigation companies. Or the quality of urban spaces by green areas, by green roofs, things like this. Suddenly becomes interesting because of mitigation. So if you look at cities like Chicago, who started these green roof programs and have become quite prominent for this, they also argue with mitigation. Renewable energies. That's an interesting point also for urban regional planning, because here renewable energies have spatial impact. They use space, so which space is available? It's highly conflictual. If you build wind power energy things, or if you use also these huge areas for solar panels, which have been developed in recent years, they are land use activities. So it's highly interesting or important to deal with these from the planning point of perspective. It's also a question of acceptance. For example, now we have this discussion in Europe that if you want to foster renewable energies, you need to build better grid, better energy grid, which means a lot of acceptance questions. Will people like to have these energy infrastructures in their neighborhood? And so this again becomes an interesting point from the point of sort of communicative planning approaches, mediation questions for renewable energies. And here it's for planners, it might become even more difficult because before you sometimes had land uses that are conflictual, that were seen quite negative from some points of view, like nuclear power plants or like motorways. But here now you have a very positive infrastructure like renewable energy infrastructure, but it produces a lot of land use conflicts. So how can we integrate these, or how can we find ways to make them possible? Because if they are rejected or if they are blocked by lawsuits and things like this, that would be traumatic. On the other side, practices from adaptation. An important point for cities has become the question of living with more water, or living with water in the first point, because water for a long time has been the river areas that were just industrial. And if you look at the development in nearly all towns in the world, you can see that there has been a shift in the last 30 years that these water sites have become assets of urban development. Hamburg with this Hafen City development is one example, but you find these developments nearly everywhere. But it's totally changed also in the ideas of living with water, of accepting water, because, for example, in Hamburg, you can see that water was seen as a sort of enemy, as something you wouldn't like to live with. There were high dikes, and they were built in a way that you have 100% security behind the dikes. That meant water was held out of living. It was no living space up to now. The river Elbe was always seen as dangerous, and you have to prevent it. It was this nightmare storm surge in '62 that had, in a way, built a sort of traumatic psychological thing in the heads of Hamburg administrators and politicians. So the question is, how can you change this? How can you reach that water is seen as a resource, as a sort of asset for cities and for regions? That's really a very interesting paradigm shift that is necessary in urban planning, or in I would not say urban planning, in city development, because that's not urban planners only. There's many different resources, many different parts of the administration, and many different politicians that are necessary to come behind this process. Many cities have many experiences, like London, or the Dutch cities with boats on the water, but where you can live, but other cities don't have. For other examples, how to use the whole city in a way, this is Rotterdam. Just talked to Willie, he told me that you heard about Rotterdam. So that's for us, Rotterdam is always one of the case studies where we have a look at what they do, and they are quite active in these ideas of living with water. Water city is one model they have developed. Or designing floodplains, that's another example, how to deal with all these areas that are near the city, but the question is where to have areas, land use possibilities for floodplains. That's a high conflictual topic, because that means on these areas might have been agriculture or other uses, but they are needed for flood protection. And it's the typical land use conflict we have to deal with in urban planning or regional planning. But living with water is also much more concrete in urban design questions like these, living with rainwaters, new ideas of holding rainwater in the city, not to have problems with the infrastructure, with the sewage infrastructure, but to hold it near the buildings or in parks, as you can see here, or new techniques, how to reduce the ceiling and so you can have more extensive drainage systems and things like this. So that's very detailed. That's also a field where urban planners have to work together very strongly with water engineers and people like this who are more experienced in these questions. Multifunctional spaces, again, a picture from Rotterdam, which is a study they have done and they want to implement it, like those things in the bottom where you have a playground that can also be used in flood events for just holding back water. But those multifunctional uses are very complicated to implement, because there are a lot of restrictions from formal questions, from the law questions, and there are also questions of acceptance. For example, we heard from Rotterdam that some young families, they just have a fear, can they be sure that they can send their children there, maybe suddenly there's water and they will have an accident there. So that's a lot of questions that have to change, or that we have to deal as planners with those also things that are sort of psychological barriers against living with water, or to integrate adaptation strategies into urban planning. That's very interesting, certainly, to deal with this. And it's not only water, it's also heat. That means how to structure settlement areas so that there's wind, so that there are wind streams, and that they are not blocked, so that the quality of life is better in those areas, that you get a green structure into these areas. These are questions you would have discussed